I'm going to ask you a question, but don't answer it yet. Why did 50,000 people cry at the same time? Why did an F-22 pilot risk his career? And why did an old man come to that airfield after 40 years? The answers are all connected. And when you learn the story, you won't be able to hold back your tears either. The morning sun cast long shadows across Maxwell Air Force Base as crowds began gathering for what promised to be the most spectacular air show of the year. Families spread blankets on the grass, children clutched toy planes, and veterans wore their service caps with quiet pride. Among them, unnoticed by the bustling crowd, stood Walter "Hawk" Harrison. At 78, Walter cut a solitary figure against the chain-link fence that separated spectators from the flight line. His weathered hands gripped the metal links as he stared at the sleek aircraft lined up like sleeping predators on the tarmac. He wore an old leather bomber jacket, the kind that had seen better decades, with patches faded beyond recognition and zippers that no longer caught properly. His granddaughter Sarah had driven him here from the assisted living facility, though she didn't understand why this particular air show mattered so much to him. Walter had been insistent, almost desperate to attend, despite his failing hearing and the medications that made long trips difficult. "You sure you'll be okay here by yourself, Grandpa?" Sarah had asked, concerned by the crowd and the noise that would soon fill the air. Walter had simply nodded, his pale blue eyes fixed on something she couldn't see. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. Just fine." But Walter wasn't fine. He hadn't been fine for 43 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not since that morning over the jungles of Vietnam when everything changed. The announcer's voice crackled over the loudspeaker, welcoming the crowd and introducing the day's performers. Walter barely heard it. His attention was focused entirely on the aircraft before him, particularly the angular, deadly-looking F-22 Raptor that sat gleaming in the morning light. Modern warfare had evolved far beyond what he had known in his flying days, but the essential truth remained the same. Young men and women still climbed into machines of war, trusting their lives to engineering and prayer. As the crowd swelled around him, Walter found himself remembering another morning, another airfield, half a world away. The memory came in fragments, the smell of aviation fuel mixed with jungle humidity, the weight of his flight suit, the face of his young wingman who had been so eager, so certain that they would both come home. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer's voice cut through Walter's reverie, "please direct your attention to runway 27 as we begin today's demonstration with a formation flight by the Thunderbirds." The crowd erupted in cheers as 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons roared to life, their engines creating a symphony of raw power that Walter felt in his chest. Despite his hearing aids, the sound transported him instantly to cockpits he had known, to missions he had flown, to a war that had ended decades ago but lived on in the quiet moments of men like him. But it wasn't the Thunderbirds that Walter had come to see. He waded through their precise aerial ballet, through the heritage flight that paired a P-51 Mustang with modern jets, through demonstration after demonstration. His legs ached from standing, but he refused to move from his spot at the fence. Then the moment came. Ladies and gentlemen, the United States Air Force is proud to present the F-22 Raptor demonstration. The crowd noise faded to a whisper as the angular stealth fighter taxied to position. Walter's knuckles went white as he gripped the fence harder. This was why he had come. This was what he needed to see. The F-22 lifted off with a grace that defied its size, climbing at an impossible angle before leveling off and beginning a series of maneuvers that seemed to mock the laws of physics. Walter watched every turn, every roll, every display of the incredible technology that protected American skies. But something was different today. Unknown to Walter, unknown to the crowd, unknown even to most of the airshow officials, the pilot of that F-22 was Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, son of Colonel David Chen, who had spent the last 15 years researching the untold stories of Vietnam air operations. Marcus had grown up hearing his father talk about the heroes who never came home, about the missions that remained classified, about the men who had sacrificed everything for brothers in arms they barely knew. Just 3 weeks ago, His father had shown him a particular file, a story that had haunted military historians for decades. The story of Captain Walter Hawk Harrison. As Marcus completed his planned demonstration, executing the final maneuver that would take him back to base altitude, something made him look down at the crowd. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was chance, or maybe it was something else entirely. But his eyes found the fence line, found the small figure in the bomber jacket, and in that instant, he saw something that made his blood run cold. The way the man stood, the way he watched the aircraft with an intensity that spoke of professional knowledge. And most telling of all, the patch on his jacket that Marcus could just make out from his altitude. A squadron patch that shouldn't exist anymore, from a unit that had been disbanded after Vietnam, from a war that had officially ended before Marcus was even born. Marcus keyed his radio, his voice tight with emotion. Tower, Raptor 1 requesting permission for unscheduled maneuver. Raptor 1, negative. Return to base altitude and prepare for landing. Marcus looked down again at the figure by the fence, and in that moment, he made a decision that would define his career. His father had taught him that some debts transcend military protocol, that some honors are more important than following orders. Tower, Raptor 1 declaring emergency override, conducting memorial flyby. Raptor 1, what is your emergency? Marcus keyed the radio one final time. Honor, Tower. My emergency is honor. What happened next had never been seen before in the history of military airshows. The F-22, instead of climbing to exit altitude, suddenly dove toward the crowd. Gasps and screams erupted from the stands as the $50 million aircraft streaked toward the fence line where Walter stood. But Marcus wasn't out of control. This was the most precise flying of his life. At exactly 200 feet above ground level, directly over the spot where Walter Harrison stood, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen executed a perfect missing man formation. Alone. The F-22 climbed vertically, rolled, and then peeled away in the classic tribute maneuver usually performed by multiple aircraft to honor fallen airmen. As Marcus completed his planned demonstration, executing the final maneuver that would take him back to base altitude, something made him look down at the crowd. Maybe it was instinct, maybe it was chance, or maybe it was something else entirely. But his eyes found the fence line, found the small figure in the bomber jacket, and in that instant, he saw something that made his blood run cold, the way the man stood, the way he watched the aircraft with an intensity that spoke of professional knowledge, and most telling of all, the patch on his jacket that Marcus could just make out from his altitude, a squadron patch that shouldn't exist anymore, from a unit that had been disbanded after Vietnam, from a war that had officially ended before Marcus was even born. Marcus keyed his radio, his voice tight with emotion. Tower, Raptor 1 requesting permission for unscheduled maneuver. Raptor 1, negative. Return to base altitude and prepare for landing. Marcus looked down again at the figure by the fence, and in that moment, he made a decision that would define his career. His father had taught him that some debts transcend military protocol, that some honors are more important than following orders. Tower, Raptor 1 declaring emergency override, conducting memorial flyby. Raptor 1, what is your emergency? Marcus keyed the radio one final time. Honor, Tower. My emergency is honor. What happened next had never been seen before in the history of military airshows. The F-22, instead of climbing to exit altitude, suddenly dove toward the crowd. Gasps and screams erupted from the stands as the $50 million aircraft streaked toward the fence line where Walter stood. But Marcus wasn't out of control. This was the most precise flying of his life. At exactly 200 feet above ground level, directly over the spot where Walter Harrison stood, Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen executed a perfect missing man formation. Alone. The F-22 climbed vertically, rolled, and then peeled away in the classic tribute maneuver usually performed by multiple aircraft to honor fallen airmen, but this wasn't for the fallen. This was for the forgotten living. Walter looked up as 50,000 pounds of the most advanced fighter aircraft ever built, screamed directly overhead, so low that he could see the pilot's helmet, so precise that the wash from the engines knocked his old baseball cap clean off his head. And in that moment, Walter Harrison, who hadn't cried in 43 years, who had buried his emotions so deep that his own family thought him incapable of feeling, collapsed to his knees and wept. The crowd, not understanding what they had witnessed but sensing its importance, fell silent. 50,000 people stopped talking, stopped moving, stopped breathing as they watched an old man in a bomber jacket kneel by the fence and sob like a child. Because Walter knew. Somehow, impossibly, miraculously, he knew. The flyby wasn't random. It wasn't a mistake. It was recognition. Sarah found her grandfather still kneeling by the fence 20 minutes later, surrounded by a respectful circle of strangers who seemed to understand that something sacred had just occurred. His face was streaked with tears, but his eyes held a light she hadn't seen in years. "Grandpa, are you okay? What happened?" Walter looked up at his granddaughter with the first real smile she had seen from him in decades. Someone remembered, sweetheart. After all these years, someone remembered. What Walter couldn't know, what the crowd couldn't know, was the story behind Lieutenant Colonel Chen's unprecedented action. It went back to that file his father had shown him, to a mission that had been classified for 40 years, to a story that had finally been declassified just months earlier. October 15th, 1972. Captain Walter Hawk Harrison and Lieutenant Tommy Chen, Marcus's uncle, had been flying escort for a rescue helicopter deep in enemy territory, when surface-to-air missiles had found their formation. When Tommy's F-4 Phantom had been hit and was going down, Walter had made an impossible choice. Instead of following protocol and returning to base, Walter had stayed. For 47 minutes he had flown alone over the jungle, drawing enemy fire, using every missile and every round of ammunition he carried to keep the rescue helicopter safe, while they extracted Tommy Chen from his downed aircraft. By the time it was over, Walter's own plane was so damaged that he barely made it back to base. The engine failed on final approach, and he had crashed on the runway, spending 3 months in a military hospital with injuries that ended his flying career forever. Tommy Chen survived. He returned home, married, had children, lived a full life that included seeing his nephew Marcus graduate from the Air Force Academy. Tommy had died just 2 years earlier, but not before making Marcus promise that if he ever had the chance, he would honor the man who saved his life, the man whose name was Walter Harrison, the man whose call sign had been Hawk, the man who had sacrificed his career, his health, and his future, so that a young pilot he barely knew could come home to his family. As Marcus taxied his F-22 back to the flight line, he could see the crowd still gathered around the fence. Military security was heading that way, probably to arrest him for violating about 15 different regulations. His career was likely over, but he had never felt better about a decision in his life. His radio crackled. "Raptor 1, this is Base Commander. Report to my office immediately upon shutdown." "Roger, sir. Understood." But as Marcus climbed out of his aircraft, he was surprised to see that he wasn't being met by military police. Instead, Colonel David Chen, his father, was waiting on the tarmac with a group of senior officers, all of whom were smiling. "Son," his father said, embracing him, "there are times when following orders is the most important thing a military officer can do. And there are times when honor demands something more. Today was one of those times." The base commander, a stern woman who had spent 30 years in the Air Force, stepped forward. Instead of the reprimand Marcus expected, she extended her hand. "Lieutenant Colonel Chen, what you did today was unauthorized, dangerous, and completely against regulations." She paused, her expression softening. "It was also exactly what needed to happen. Captain Harrison has been invited to join us for dinner tonight, where he will finally receive the recognition he should have gotten 40 years ago." Meanwhile, by the fence, Walter was finally able to stand with Sarah's help. The crowd had thinned, but several people approached him with questions, with thanks, with recognition that something important had just occurred. An elderly man in a Vietnam veteran's cap shook Walter's hand. "I don't know your story, friend, but I know honor when I see it. Thank you for your service." A young airman, barely out of basic training, saluted him with a crispness that would have made any drill instructor proud. "Sir, that was the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." But it was the little girl who broke Walter's heart all over again. She couldn't have been more than 6 years old, and she walked up to him with the fearless curiosity of childhood. "Mister, why did the airplane fly over just you?" she asked. Walter knelt down so he could look her in the eyes, this child who represented everything he and his generation had fought to protect. "Because sometimes, little one, when you do the right thing, it takes a long time for people to notice. But eventually, if you're very lucky, someone does." That evening, at the base commander's dinner, Walter Harrison finally heard the words he had waited 43 years to hear. In a room full of active duty officers, surrounded by the flags and traditions of the service he had loved, he was formally thanked for his actions over the skies of Vietnam. Marcus Chen presented him with a plaque that read, "To Captain Walter Hawk Harrison, whose courage under fire and sacrifice for a fellow airman embodies the highest traditions of the United States Air Force. Your wingman came home because of you." But the moment that Walter would remember for the rest of his life came when Marcus leaned in and whispered, "Uncle Tommy told me to tell you, Hawk, I kept the light on for you. Welcome home." As the evening wound down, Sarah drove her grandfather back to the assisted living facility, but he was a different man than the one she had picked up that morning. The weight he had carried for 4 decades seemed lighter somehow, the shadows in his eyes replaced by something that looked like peace. "Grandpa," she said as they pulled into the parking lot, "I never knew you were a hero." Walter smiled, the same real smile he had discovered again that afternoon. "I wasn't a hero, sweetheart. I was just a pilot who couldn't leave a friend behind. The heroes are the ones who made it home and used their second chance to make the world better." He paused, looking out at the night sky where somewhere above them young pilots were still standing watch, still protecting the freedom that previous generations had paid for with their blood and their futures. "But today," he said quietly, "today I finally felt like I came home too." 6 months later, Walter Harrison passed away peacefully in his sleep. His funeral was attended by over 300 people, including Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Chen, who served as one of his pallbearers. The F-22 demonstration team performed a missing man formation over the cemetery, and Walter was buried with full military honors. But the real memorial to Walter Harrison isn't his gravestone or the plaque that now hangs in the Air Force Academy Museum. It's the story that Marcus Chen tells to every young pilot under his command, the story of what it really means to leave no one behind, of how honor sometimes requires us to risk everything for someone we barely know, and of how the debts we owe to our brothers and sisters in arms can span decades but are never forgotten. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, if we live long enough, and if the universe aligns just right, we get the chance to pay them back. The question I asked you at the beginning, why did 50,000 people cry at the same time, has its answer now. They cried because they witnessed something rare in this world, the moment when sacrifice is finally recognized, when honor is finally rewarded, and when a hero finally comes home. If this story of courage and recognition moved you like it moved everyone at that air show, please hit that like button and subscribe to True Hero Stories. We share powerful narratives about the quiet heroes who walk among us, the veterans whose sacrifices often go unnoticed, and the moments when honor finally gets its due. Do you have stories about veterans or unsung heroes in your community? Share them in the comments below. Your story might be featured in our next episode. Where are you watching from? Drop your city in the comments and let us know if you've ever witnessed a moment when someone finally got the recognition they deserved. Remember, every veteran carries stories we may never know. Every hero deserves honor, regardless of how long it takes to arrive. Hit that notification bell so you never miss stories that matter. Thank you for honoring our veterans by watching, and we'll see you in the next True Hero Stories episode.